Thank you all very much for coming tonight to this lecture. Wonderful to be here again in Abu Dhabi at the Abrahamic Faith Center, and looking forward very much to talking to you tonight about the latest discoveries at Siniya Island in the Emirate of Al Quwain. Some of you may already have heard of the discovery of the monastery. It's been in the press quite a lot, and I thought maybe I could explain a little bit about the circumstances in which the monastery was discovered, because this, I think, sort of reveals the archaeological process in action, and I think it's kind of a nice way to sort of begin the lecture and introduce you to the site. So basically, in the winter of 2021, a team from the Tourism Archaeology Department in Umm Al Quwain were digging on a site at the northeastern area of the island. This was prompted really because of Sheikh Majid bin Saud al-Mu'alla, who was personally interested in the island of Siniya because of stories that he'd heard that the island was the original place where the Al-Ali settled and established their emirate in the remote past. He believed that here on the island he would find the fort, the mosque, established by his great ancestor Majid I, his namesake in fact, in the early 18th century. So he set his archaeologists to dig a prominent mound covered with rubble, and they revealed a series of small walls, and they were slightly puzzled because it didn't look like a mosque and it didn't look like a fort, and they really didn't know what it was. So the reports were kind of passed around a little bit, and they went off to the Ministry of Culture, where they reached the desk of Peter Hellier, who sadly died a year or so ago, but he was very much involved with archaeology. He was passionate about archaeology, and he also didn't quite understand what these images were, and so he contacted me, and we went up to Siniya Island together to have a look in person at this. And I said to him, look, this is quite clearly a church. But when we looked at these sort of drone images, and you know, at the area which had been excavated up to this point at the end of the 2021 winter season, you could see what I thought was perhaps the nave here, and then an aisle here, and that presumably then there'd be another kind of aisle over here in this kind of unexcavated area, what we call the bulk in archaeology, and that probably it was going to look rather like this on the right. You can see here a plan of the church found at Al-Qusur in Kuwait. So that's what I thought we had. And when we began to dig in the next winter in 2022, we found something rather different. Not a tripartite basilica, but a single-aisled chapel surrounded by monastic buildings. So let's begin then with the guides to the monastery and the most important part, the chapel. So this is the chapel. Essentially, you can see we have the nave, originally built with sort of benches around the side, and then in here we have the sanctuary, which would have had an altar fitted into a socket at the end here. The altar, I think, probably would have stood to about waist height and may have been a sort of wooden cabinet, and may in fact have had been some sort of a reliquary. It's quite common actually in these late antique churches to have the bones of a saint interred within, and perhaps we can imagine that there was some local saint who was perhaps stored in this cabinet, the altar, and when the site was abandoned, it was taken with them. They took the remains with them, they took the altar with them, because this was the focal point of the church and the communal identity of the people worshipping here. Now, this is not by any means a unique building. There are, in fact, several single-aisled churches known from the Gulf region. The first of these, most clearly, is up at Al-Qusur in Kuwait. You can see here. It's been argued as well that the Hajj monastery on the southern coast of Iran, which is over here, actually has at its core a single-aisled chapel, and that the two aisles and narthex which surround it, being open, were more like corridors to emphasize the sanctuary within. but that, I think, is a little bit debatable. But certainly, it might have started off life as a single-aisle chapel. Now, I think what's really remarkable about this is that the excavation of the sanctuary revealed the material culture of Christian ritual preserved in situ. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean, essentially, you have all of the objects that are used by Christians in the Mass. On Sundays, you'll go to church and meet the priest, and he gives them the sacrament. We have these large glass chalices in which wine is presented to the faithful, symbolizing the blood of Christ. Bread is also given to the faithful, symbolizing the body of Christ. This is essentially a reconstruction of the Last Supper. And in fact, we found just next door to this chapel a small oven which was used for the baking of the bread to be used in the Holy Communion. But also then we have this lamp. Now the lamp, this is a little brass lamp, which is described in the liturgies of the Syriac church. You have these liturgies, they read like sort of the scripts of plays, you know. First of all, you do this, and then you do this, and then you light the lamp, and it symbolizes this, and then you sort of pass it around. And so essentially what you have here are objects which were used in the Mass. Now, I think that's really remarkable because this has never been found. This has never been found in the Gulf before, and it's incredibly rare in any kind of archaeological context that you'd find this stuff, okay? So again, there is this sort of further evidence for the Eucharist. I mean, this is the oven I was talking about, its position just here. And again, they found exactly the same thing in Al Qusur. So, you know, there is definitely a kind of a plan, a prototype, which the people on Siniya and the people at Al Qusur were shared, you know, as part of a shared culture in the region. The other thing is we have these really nice parallels for the lamp. Now, these are from the Benaki Museum in Athens, which I visited a year or so ago. And basically, these are from Egypt, ultimately, and they're from this sort of 6th, 7th centuries, so very much the same sort of period as Siniya Church. Anybody who is interested in ancient Christianity starts to read, and very quickly you'll discover that there are all these different sects, you know, and there are all these different kind of understandings of Christian theology. And when you read this stuff, you kind of feel that these sects were kind of deeply opposed to each other, and they sort of were sort of fighting each other and things like that. And to a certain extent that was true, but I think it's also worth stressing that there was a shared Christian experience across the region. In fact, monasticism in the Gulf traces its origin back to Mar Augen, who was basically an Egyptian saint who had lived in the eastern desert of Egypt and came to Mesopotamia and brought the habit of monasticism to the Gulf. Whether or not he ever existed is open to debate. Certainly this is the legendary origin of monasticism, which attempted to basically place the Gulf tradition in a line of descent with that of Egypt, with the Desert Fathers, St. Anthony, St. Paul, Pachomius, these kind of guys who had invented monasticism in Egypt. So the fact that we have a lamp which is sort of basically done in the same style, possibly even imported from Egypt, I think is a sort of material representation of that same looking to Egypt as a source of monastic inspiration. Now, one of the things that was asked me when I identified this as a church was, well, hang on, if it's a church, why haven't we got any crosses? Well, not all churches were elaborately decorated. This one here, this is from the Oxford excavations at the Arab capital of Al-Hira in southern Iraq, a Christian Arab kingdom that flourished in the centuries before the rise of Islam. And you can see here that just there's a crucifix, there's a cross, scratched into the plaster. And Talbot Rice, the excavators, actually had to colour the plate to show us that there is something there, because the scratch was so ephemeral and really not visible even to the camera. So our preservation at Siniya probably doesn't go up that far. It only kind of goes up to about knee height. So essentially any kind of decorated plaster above that would have fragmented, would have collapsed, would have fallen to powder and eventually kind of disintegrated, right? So we haven't got any decorated stucco. It's not the same kind of establishment as Sir Beni Yas, which is interesting. It's more, I think, of a kind of a vernacular tradition oriented towards a kind of a settlement community than a sort of a retreat where you kind of meditate and pray. So around the chapel, we have a series of communal buildings. And this really is what distinguishes this as a monastery, because monasticism is about holy men coming together to live a life of prayer and meditation. This type of religious experience is known as Cenobitic monasticism. Essentially, people would live in relative isolation, scattered around the monastery, but they would come together for communal events, communal prayer, communal meals. So they had their sort of their isolation out here, and we'll look at those monks' cells in a minute. But then at the heart of it all was this communal complex where people would come together and pray and share meals, as indeed they had been taught to do by Jesus of Nazareth himself, who broke bread with his disciples. Okay, so this is the kind of the tradition which I think is encapsulated in these buildings. So here we have the original chapel, and then there's a whole series of buildings which are added to it over the next 100 years or so, including, well, there's a number of things which are interesting. First of all, they build the prothesis and the diaconicon either side of the sanctuary. These are kind of elements of the kind of part of an elaboration of church architecture, which can be traced back to Justin II in the late 6th century. So they've kind of added those bits. Essentially, this is where you would kind of bake the bread and prepare the communal, the mass. And then over here, this is where you keep all the kind of the relics, the equipment which was needed for the mass. There are also kind of special kind of washing basins here where you'd wash the chalice and all these other things, because they are sacred objects. You're not just going to wash them with all your other kind of bowls and things. So they have like a special place for washing and ritual purity. Other things, and this is very important for the monastery, is this: the refectory. Okay, it's essentially a large rectangular building with sort of benches around the side, and this is where people would come together. It functioned in some ways like a majlis. People would come and discuss the kind of needs of the community, but it's also a kind of place where they would get together and they would sort of they would sing hymns or maybe chant psalms. It's a place also where they probably shared meals. So really, this is their kind of the communal space par excellence of the monastery. We also have a cistern used for the storage of fresh water. There may or may not be a well on Siniya Island. We've not really positively identified it. And fresh water may actually have been brought by boats from outside. Again, suggesting that this monastery is part of a kind of wider network, and that the people living here were dependent on that network for their way of life. What I think is also fascinating is up here, we have this font, which we'll come back to shortly. So the font is positioned immediately behind the sanctuary. It is, I think, a baptismal font for full immersion baptism. Okay, so today Christians mostly kind of sort of dab some water on the baby's head as a sort of symbolic kind of baptism. But in the early church, based on the model of John the Baptist, whose head incidentally resides in Damascus, John the Baptist is the one who baptizes Christ. He dips him in the River Jordan and he emerges pure. And so full immersion baptism is fundamentally part of early Christian ritual. It's no surprise really to have it here. I think what's fascinating about baptism is that it appears in the Syriac literature. We have a whole series of Aramaean holy men. Ahudama, for example, who's a Mesopotamian monk, he goes off baptizing the Arabs. Okay, there is, I think, a baptismal movement in the region in this period. Also, after the rise of Islam, there's a really fascinating moment which Al-Baladhri talks about, in which the Christian Arab tribe of Taghlib refuse to live in the Umayyad Caliphate because the Umayyad caliphs are trying to forbid the ritual of baptism. So we have these historical sources, and now I think we have a sort of a material representation of this, which again is important because this is the first time we've found a baptismal tank in Eastern Arabia. The refectory, which I talked about already, is something, again, very important. You get the idea here with the benches, and you can actually see the kind of the wear on the benches as people have sat there over several decades, hundreds of years. This, I think, really is probably the most important building at the monastery, aside from the chapel itself, because this was really the focus of communal life. Okay, so if we have this communal aspect to the monastery, we then also have this private and quietist aspect where people would go in retreat and would get away from everybody and dedicate themselves to the worship of God. So all around this monastic court, we have scattered cells for the monks. This is Siniya with the monastery, and then all of the cells of the monks sort of scattered around. This is Siyabanias with the monastery, and then cells for the monks scattered around. And this is El Qusur with the monastery, and then cells for the monks scattered around. So I think you get the idea that in every single one of these sites, pretty much, you have this Cenobitic model of a communal core, and then this area of personal retreat where you can basically commune with God and escape the kind of the babble of people. And what do they look like? Well, they're very simple buildings. They're mostly 1 or 2 rooms. They're not very big, actually. They're probably about 2 to 3 meters wide and about 3 to 5 meters long. You can sort of tell with the dimensions that they were probably roofed. And in Arabian architecture, through the centuries, there's a repeated pattern that you can build rooms as long as you want, but you can only build them to a certain width because of the availability of the roofing material, right? So these would essentially have been the trunks taken from palm trees, maybe mangrove poles, laid across on top and then kind of covered with the palms. And we see the same kind of pattern with other monasteries in the region. So if you think here, what we've got essentially is a sort of bipartite building. If you ignore this bit, which is an extension, probably had a kind of covered area for sleeping and an open area, a small courtyard for living and working. And that, I think, is really what you've got here in Siyabanias. If you take away these two, which is an extension, you have, again, the covered space and an open courtyard. Okay. So there's another building which we discovered at Siniya. Essentially, you can see just here, a little bit away from the communal complex, we have this large courtyard building. Now, the scale of it is actually fairly analogous to the monastery itself. So this is kind of an important building, quite clearly, because of its size. It's something that's actually been expanded. It's been expanded twice over the period of occupation of the monastery. And I think there are some interesting parallels here. I mean, this is not an exact parallel, but it's here at the monastery of Kharj in southern Iran. The French excavators identified this as an infirmary, a place where people who were sick would go and get treated and would be separated from the rest of the community. But actually, I think that's not the right interpretation. And when you read the late antique texts, the Syriac texts, the role of the abbot, the head of the monastic community, comes through very clearly. The abbot had all sorts of responsibilities. He was not just the leader of the community, but also he was the host. Anybody who came to visit would be hosted in the abbot's house. We have this, there's a nice 7th century Syriac text, the history of Mar Yonan, a sort of hagiography of a Gulf saint, and he visits different monasteries and he lives in the abbot's house, right? So I think there is kind of this role of the head of the community has these sort of roles, has these responsibilities, these obligations, and that I think kind of helps us explain this building. So we have, I think, then not just the church and the monastery and the monks, but we also have the abbot, okay? And in fact, if you want to push it, you could argue that this was perhaps the bishop's house. Now, today perhaps we have this idea of bishops as being very kind of powerful, lords of the church with their palaces and whatnot. But I think in this sort of period, the bishops were, I think, much closer to their flock, much more humble, much more politically engaged as well, actually. They're quite boisterous, the bishops. You know, they're constantly disagreeing with each other and splitting from the church, then coming back and writing letters to each other, kind of, you know, talking about all of this stuff. And so we have a whole series of references to the bishop of Beit Mazunya. Beit Mazunya, in Syriac, basically it means Oman, right? Mazun, Oman, same thing. Whereas Oman, well, it's basically southeastern Arabia, including the Emirates and the northern part of today's Sultanate of Oman. So the Bishop of Oman appears in the Acts of the Synods of the Nestorian Church from about 544 through to 676. So this period is when we have historical attestation for a Bishop of Oman. And actually this is, as we'll come to see, pretty much exactly the period in which the Siniya Monastery is thriving, okay? So it's not exactly a smoking gun, but it is a circumstantial argument that you can make suggesting that perhaps this building was the residence of the abbot, the bishop, in fact, of Oman. So with those that sort of overview of the monastery complete, I think we should turn perhaps to some of the more exciting and interesting questions, like, you know, when was it built? Why was it built? Those kind of things. So first of all, there is not really a single point of inception. It's not like this was suddenly established and boom, right? It's something that grew and developed in a series of phases over potentially about 200 years, okay? So essentially what we have is a single freestanding rectangular building here, which is added to create a church, a chapel. That's then expanded again significantly by the extension of these diaconicon and prothesis and the refectory and cistern. That really turns it into a monastery. And then there's a second phase of expansion as more buildings are added. Interestingly, the font appears to be one of the last things built at the site of the monastery, as if to say maybe something's happening in the region and that, you know, there's another kind of added incentive to kind of bring people into Christianity or keep people in the Christian faith. And what we can do then, having established this sequence, is start to date it. Now, we can use ceramics to date things, but a perhaps more accurate and absolute form of dating is radiocarbon. These give us a date range, okay? It's not 100% accurate, but I think it is useful. So what is particularly useful for us is that we found embedded in the preparation surface for the floor of the monastery, okay, that's the phase of expansion that expands the church into a living monastery, a piece of charcoal that when analyzed in the lab produced a date range between the 560s and 630s. Now if we take the very latest date for that, right, in 634 or 641, depending on how you calibrate the data, that gives us a terminus antiquem for the construction of the church. The church must have been built before that date. So that pushes us back. Well, how far we don't know exactly, but I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to suggest that the church was established around the turn of the 7th century, around the, say, 600 Christian era. Yeah? So that makes this the best dated of these monasteries in the Arabian Gulf. So far, there's been a bit of a controversy about when exactly they're established, but I think it's really fascinating that the expansion of monasticism in the Gulf is in fact a parallel process to the rise of Islam. Right? I think people have got a bit confused about this. You know, oh, are they built before or after Islam? Well, actually, it's neither. They're contemporary. It's a parallel process, and that I think opens up this debate to a whole range of fascinating speculation. And essentially, you see that from the late 6th century, there's a sudden massive growth in historical evidence. We have a whole series of synods, of powerful bishops and abbots who establish monastic practices in Eastern Arabia. We have the beginning of the acceptance of Christianity by the Sasanian Persian Empire, which dominated the region in this period. And around 600 really is a moment in time when the great Persian Sasanian Emperor Khusro marries his Christian wife and starts dealing with the Christians in a kind of greater way. Hitherto, they'd been persecuted. Right? There's a whole series of persecutions that happen in the Persian Sasanian Empire. But around this period, in the late 6th century, they are accepted into the community. They finally enter civil society. And I think, that I think is important for understanding why all of these different monasteries are being built in this period. Because essentially, I think they probably all date to the same sort of 7th, 8th century sort of episode. And I think you can see that this is in some ways a response to the acceptance of Christianity in the Eastern late antique empire. So we can also think a little bit about how this church, this monastery, fits into the historical geography of Eastern Arabia. We do have glimpses from the Syriac sources in late antiquity and from the Arabic sources in the early Islamic period, glimpses of places in the past which we don't always know where they are. Some of them can be identified. Al-Hajar, for example. Hajar, well, where was that? Probably Al-Hassa in eastern Saudi Arabia. But there are other sites which are kind of a bit more open to interpretation, and I think with a little bit of analysis, we can start to place them here in the Emirates and make some identifications of exactly where this was. So, first of all, let's have a think about Siyah Bani Yas. This is the kind of sister site to Siniya in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, another island with a monastery down here. This has been identified with the mysterious Black Island, which is mentioned in the hagiography of Mar Yonan, Saint Jonah, in the kind of 7th, 8th century, same sort of period as these are being built. So the Black Island, people have suggested that it's Siyah Bani Yas, which, with the eye of faith, you can kind of squint at it and see that maybe this is the Black Island. But alternatively, I think it's interesting that Siniya Island, is actually made of black beach rock. Right? If you go and have a look there, right, the actual stone, the kind of stabilized sandbars, which kind of form the island, are black. Right? The other thing which is interesting about this, we hear of a monastery of Mar Thoma, right? St. Thomas, the monastery of St. Thomas, situated on the Black Island. And I think this, for me, is where we start to kind of pull much more strongly towards Siniya. The monastery of Mar Thoma is situated on the coast of Mazun in the Syriac literature. But by the time we come to look at the early Islamic Arabic sources, we read about a place called Tu'am, which is situated on the coast of Oman, right? And I think it's basically the same place, mutatis mutandis, from Syriac into Arabic, Mar Thoma becomes Tu'am. And that, I think, is the kind of progression of this etymology. Te'om in Hebrew, To'ama in Syriac, Tu'am in Arabic becomes Thoma in Greek, which gives us the English European name Thomas. Yeah? Who was Thomas? He wasn't just anybody, it's not just a name. Thomas is one of the apostles of Christ. He is the apostle of the East. He is the founder of the Eastern Church in Mesopotamia, Persia, and India. Today, we still have the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala, right, whose liturgy is still Syriac, which goes back to this ancient founding father. And Eusebius tells us, this is the great church historian, Thomas, so the tradition has it, obtained as his portion Parthia. Parthia meaning the Persian Empire, which was understood here to refer to all of these eastern lands. Okay? So I think we have then a good reason to imagine that the monastery on Siniya Island can be identified with the monastery of St. Thomas off the coast of the Gulf Coast of the Emirates, basically. Okay? And I think, again, this needs to be placed into a historical context. Why should there be a monastery on the Gulf Coast of the Emirates? Well, when you read the sources, all of the tribes here, with the exception of Al-Azd, were Christian at the time of the rise of Islam, right? So the Sama bin Lu'ay bin Ghalib of Quraysh, Christian. Abdul Qais of Rabi'a bin Nizar, Christian. Hanifa of Bakr bin Wa'il, Christian. The Banu Sa'd of Tamim, Christian. right? These are all tribes which live in Tuam. So I think you can quite neatly situate the monastery of Siniya within the historical geography of late antiquity and early Islam. I think you can make a circumstantial argument for the identification of the settlement right next door as the principal settlement of Tuam. And I think you can argue that the monastery of Siniya can be identified with the monastery of St. Thomas mentioned in the hagiographical literature. This really takes us a little bit further away from Siniya, but essentially we are able to reconstruct a Christian Arabian Gulf from the Syriac sources. So this leads us to the final element of the discussion, which is, why was it abandoned? When and why was the monastery abandoned? Well, first of all, we need to think about the date. The radiocarbon dates help us, but the ceramic assemblage in this case really helps us, and we can pinpoint it fairly accurately. We can say that the monastery was abandoned before the mid-8th century. There's certain types of pottery very commonly found in this part of the world which are absent here. So 750, that's the date we're thinking of, right? That's when it all finishes on this island. So what's happening in the kind of 150 years since the foundation of the church in around 600? Well, a whole series of things. The Sasanian Persian Empire implodes into civil war in the 620s. The Muslim Arabs of the Hijaz start their expansion across Arabia into the Fertile Crescent. Other Arab groups are also active, raiding the Persian Empire as it disintegrates. And I think it's not unreasonable to think that some of the local community participated in the Arab conquest of the Persian Empire. In fact, there is a whole series of historical sources which tell us about the participation of these tribes, which I've just been talking to you about. These tribes are involved in maritime raids on the province of Fars in southwestern Iran. They are important actually in they're a distracting force which allows the main Muslim army to come in from the other side, and they play a role in the Arab-Muslim conquest of Iran. Okay? So I think arguably some of the local people are joining in this new venture for all sorts of reasons, because it's exciting, because they can get rich, because they can do glorious deeds, and I think as they're getting swept up in the conquests and in the process converting to Islam. And as things settle down, after the resolution of the second fitna, when Abdul Malik and the Marwanids basically established for the first time an Arab-Muslim state, increasingly, I think, being Muslim becomes a mark of social superiority. It becomes something that people aspire to. And there are all sorts of tax reasons as well, but essentially, I think as we start to see the emergence of a confident, powerful Arab-Muslim state, symbolized here by such monumental buildings as the Dome of the Rock, or Walid's Mosque in Damascus, or the amazing gold dinar of Abdul Malik, the standing caliph with his hand on his sword, ready to strike down his enemies, and the whip on his elbow, ready to punish those who err from the path. These symbols of a powerful, confident new civilization, I think, were seductive, and many people, I think, embraced Islam in this period. So I think the 8th century is kind of a tipping point. It's after the conquest, when things calm down, when there's a new social structure. That, I think, gives us the kind of framework for the social cultural change, the conversion from Christianity to Islam. But there are other elements to this story. In this period, between the 540s and the 760s, we have the first global pandemic, the Justinianic plague, which reoccurs pretty much every 15 years. Now, there are different estimates about how many people died in this period, but if it was anything like the Black Death in the later medieval period, you could say about a third of the population died, right? And people debate this, right? But clearly the Justinianic plague was a problem. And here, at the cemetery, next to the monastery on Siniya Island, we found plague pits. We found mass graves. Graves, each one about 3 to 4 meters in diameter, filled with dozens of bodies stacked on top of each other, disposed of quickly, we did osteological analysis of the bones. This is a forensic team from the University of Bologna. These people did not die a violent death. There are no cut marks on their bones. They were not killed in battle or massacred or anything like that. We're waiting for the pathogen analysis. Of course, you're always waiting for the results of the lab, but basically you can make, again, a good argument. Why else would you bury large numbers of people in a pit, okay? It's happening exactly the right time for the appearance of the Justinianic plague in the region. So I think perhaps this contributed to the decline of the monastery. But I think the real kind of nail in the coffin for this Siniya community was the Abbasid invasion of Oman by the Caliph al-Safa. Now, this, I think it's important to stress, wasn't about Muslims against Christians. This was about Muslims against heretical Muslims, right? So you had a whole group of Muslims, the Khawarij, the rebels, people who basically went off into Eastern Arabia and kind of did their own thing. They didn't want to be part of the community. Those people thrived in Eastern Arabia, and eventually they started causing some problems. They started attacking people, raiding people. So the Caliph sent an army to deal with this problem. And so this army arrived on the Gulf coast of the Emirates, and they resorted to a form of collective punishment in which the coastal settlements were systematically picked off. And we're told, in fact, that there's one of the army of the Abbasids who's from Central Asia, and he brought with him a kind of new technology, a kind of Greek fire, basically oil that's set on fire and sprayed, and that they used this to destroy the Arish houses of the people living on the coast. So I think basically people ran away. They fled. There's this slow kind of long-term process of conversion as Islam becomes the dominant socio-cultural force in the region. There is also then the Justinianic plague, which kind of eats into the population, and it starts to dwindle over time. But I think finally, the last thing which kind of goes wrong for these people is this invasion. So I think this is the final act of the monastery of Siniya. It takes time for it to grow and it expand, and then it also takes time for it to sort of fade away and finally disappear. I think we need to recognize that this is a lost chapter of Arab and Emirati history. The Arabian Peninsula in the century before the rise of Islam was mostly Christian. There were Jewish communities, but by this time most people had converted to Christianity, and you see it across the region. This is the capital, this is the palace of Abraha, the kind of Ethiopian, Yemeni general, and here you can see a Christian saint. The Ghassanids, the Ghassasina in Bilad al-Sham, ruled from the northern Hijaz right the way up through to the kind of frontiers of Turkey and Egypt. Huge territory under their control. And they were great sponsors of church architecture. You can see here the shrine of Saint Sergius, who was a sort of patron saint of Arab Christianity in the Byzantine Empire, at the Ghassanid center of Rasafa in Syria. Here we have Arab sheikhs building monasteries in the lands of Palestine and Syria. And closer to home, the Lakhmids, the Manadhara, the great Arab Christian kingdom of southern Iraq, who we are told ruled the regions of Eastern Arabia, including Oman, the region of today's Emirates and Sultanate. And there's a whole series of royal women, Hind the Elder and Hind the Younger, who built monasteries in Al-Hira. So I think arguably what you could say about Siniya, going back to why it was built, who built it and why, was it the Nestorians, the church itself kind of coming and building, or was it a local Arab ruler building a monastery as a form of political legitimation? Right? The church conveyed political legitimacy to these rulers at a time when the Persian Empire is fragmenting, that the Lakhmid Confederation is fragmenting. There are opportunities for local rulers to assert themselves and present themselves as legitimate rulers. How do you do that? You build a church, and a church gives you legitimacy. So again, I think we can situate this in a pattern of Christian Arab patronage in Eastern Arabia and the wider region.